now also with this pawn on d5, now this pawn is never going to be weak because
Mm-hmm.
this file is blocked. So we want to make sure we don't rush into anything. So what else could we try?
We can try to exchange off their knight then, and so they only have a dark squared bishop, and we have control of the white squares.
Right.
So bishop g5.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So now, again, we're trying to remove this defender so that when we capture, we can play knight d5. So, of course, we couldn't do it right away because, say black plays, I don't know, a6 or something. So takes, now don't forget this knight's pinned. So we wouldn't, we're not threatening to capture right away, but we're just putting pressure on black's position. And it immediately pays dividends because black makes a very weak move. Black plays knight to d5 here. So it works tactically in that he doesn't lose material. So the idea is if bishop takes bishop, black's going to recapture with his knight and not lose material. And if we capture this knight somehow, then this bishop's hanging. So tactically it doesn't lose material, but positionally it's a terrible move. So why is this move so terrible?
Because it immediately gives up the d5 square, which is
exactly. So
weakness.
What should white do to take advantage of it?
Well, we wanted to exchange the bishop for the knight anyway, so knight takes and bishop takes.
Right. So but it's important to note that we want to capture this knight with a knight and not with the pawn.
Yeah, right.
Because again, we want to have control of this square, and we want to eventually force this, which will make this square weak. So we play knight takes d5, right? But now notice that we're just exchanging these pieces, and we don't have to worry about this pin that was going to happen if we initiated the capture. So by black initiating this exchange, it's basically giving us exactly what we want. So bishop takes g5. We play queen g3. So we're gaining tempo, and we're getting also ready to perhaps push this pawn and start getting some sort of either kingside attack or central attack, depending. But it's important to gain a tempo, and also we want to reroute our queen to a better square. Also notice this queen is attacking d6 now, so c6 just gives us, we're already attacking the target that we're anticipating is going to happen. So queen g3, black retreats his bishop back to d8, so he wants to kind of dominate the knight now by controlling these diagonals. So now, these squares are all protected. Okay, so now what should white do here?
Well, does the kingside attack still work? F4?
Yeah, it does, but we can remember we always want to have our pieces as active as possible. So which of our pieces isn't doing much right now?
Well, the rook on A1 isn't, so if we bring it to D1, it's targeting down the D6 pawn.
Exactly. Yeah. So so rook D1 makes a lot of sense, because now if if C6 chasing this knight away, we go knight E3 and then knight C4, and this pawn's going to be falling because we got 1, 2, and now don't forget this C4 square is very weak. In fact, it's so weak that this knight's going to be an unassailable knight on C4. Because, again, this pawn is backward, and we're going to eventually end up winning a pawn. So c6 is not something that black can do. So black tries to lash out with f5, but this move is definitely not very good. So this knight on d5 is really controlling all of black's play. Like, black finding it completely fruitless to do anything, because no matter what black does, he just makes his position worse. But f5 was probably the worst of all the evils. Okay, so after f5, how does white take advantage of this mistake?
No, that doesn't make sense. F3's too passive.
So think about a way of trying to make that knight legitimately an eternal knight. See if there's a way we can try to do that.
E5.
A little bit of tactics involved, but see if you can see the tactics and see which would allow that knight to become an eternal knight.
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I looked at is knight f6, but that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the bishop's on it, don't forget.
Yeah.
That's why he played bishop d8.
Right.
What else could he do? What else could white do?
Pawn takes. Hmm. I don't know. Want to give me any hints?
Sure. So, what 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 of his pieces and what of our pieces are kind of in line with each other?
We've got the rook on his queen.
Right. There are some pieces in the way, but yeah. So, is there
Right.
a way we can maybe try to remove that d6 pawn out of the way?
Does e5 make sense then?
Okay, but tell me why it does or doesn't make sense.
Well, if e5 and he takes, then we've got that knight check and he loses the queen.
Right. Exactly. But more importantly,
More importantly, we can take it.
take what?
Can take d6,
And
then he takes, and then there's no pawn that'll ever kick the knight.
exactly. So tactically, we can play e5.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, yeah, if he takes knight f6, just wins the queen. But the more
Yeah.
important point is that we're simply threatening to take, and then when he takes, now this knight is indeed legitimately an unassailable knight, and we don't have to worry about c6 ever being a problem.
Right.
So e5 is indeed a good move. So after rook e8, pawn takes pawn, and if queen takes, it's even worse because this endgame is just completely hopeless. So black tries to keep the queens on, but okay. So now how does again we have this unassailable knight. So how does white conclude matters here?
Um, he's got we could try to pick up a pawn. He's got the really weak pawn on f5,
Mm-hmm.
and a7's pretty weak too.
Yeah, that's true. But let's try to get all our pieces into the game before we start trying to attack his weaknesses. Because I mean, the
Right.
great thing about the weaknesses is that they're not going away. So there's no need
Right.
to kind of target them immediately. It's
Right.
more important that we get all of our pieces as active as possible first. But I mean,
Right.
you're absolutely right. That's eventually how we're going to win. But it's
Okay.
a lot easier to attack his weaknesses if we are able to have all our pieces develop. So
Right. So I mean, yeah, pawns are pretty slow. So c4 lets the d file, the d rook, get into the game instead of defending the knight.
true, but the knight's not attacked right now, right? So there's
Right.
no immediate need for c4. I mean,
Mm,
it's possible that we're going to play c4 at some point in the future, but it's not necessary at the moment. So what piece of ours is probably the least active piece right now?
the f rook
Yep.
is just hiding behind the pawn.
Yep. So can we activate it?
If we bring it to e1, we have to trade it off, but that's fine, I guess, when you're in a better
Because
position.
this rook right now is better than this rook, right?
Right. Right.
And this rook is doing nothing. So if we just trade rooks on e1 and we end up with a rook on e1, that's good for us, right? Because our rook will be better than his rook. So we shouldn't be worried about exchanges here. Exchanges only help us in a way because it just magnifies his weaknesses, and it means he has fewer pieces to defend his weaknesses. So rook f1 is fine. So black plays rook e6. So he's trying to control the e file. So the idea is if we take, now he's controlling the e file. So we want to make sure we control the e file. So we play knight f4, forcing his rook to move again. So now he has nothing better than to simply take the rook because otherwise we could just take on, his rook really has nowhere else to go. So now we're controlling the e file. So now he's trying to get his bishop into the game. So bishop a5. So what should white play here? So our rook is attacked currently.
Right. So we're obviously going to move it. So e2 is a little passive. e6 is supported by the knight, and attacks the d6 pawn again.
Right, but where does the knight want to be ultimately?
Back on d5.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So just, or maybe then move it to either d1 or e2.
Okay, right. So on d1 we're supporting d5, but we're giving control of the e file. On e2 we're keeping control of the e file, but we're allowing black maybe to play d5 or something.
Uh-huh.
Right? So which one's better?
Well, we want the e file. So, and then he's got the other weaknesses too. So might as well stay on e2.
Actually, you have something even better, which I was tricking you a little bit. But the actual best move here is to play knight d5, because don't forget, if bishop takes
It's
rook,
not
we
being
have this
attacked.
idea. So this bishop on a5 needs to go back to d8 to defend this fork, because remember this is
There's a
illegal
pin,
when he's
right,
queen,
right.
right? So it gains a tempo. So now we're able to play. So now we're able to keep our rook on the e file as well as get our knight on d5. So it's just a clever move to gain a tempo. So basically,
Mm-hmm.
black is forced to play bishop d8 to help
Mm-hmm.
defend this square, because also we were threatening simply rook e7 and queen takes g7 mate. So black had to retreat, and now we keep our knight here and we keep our rook here. So we have a completely dominating position. So how should white continue here? So now we have basically almost. So we have our pieces pretty much in their optimal positions. So
Mm-hmm.
what should we do from here?
Um, Target his weaknesses or create more weaknesses
Create
by
more weaknesses.
yeah. So moving a3, b3.
So these pawns are pretty
Mm,
much good. We're not going
yeah,
to be able to create more weaknesses by moving these pawns. So what
yeah.
else could we do?
Well, we can bring the h pawn into the game
Yep,
and try to target down the
yep,
g7 pawn
yep,
again.
exactly. So h4. So not only does this give our king a fight square, but also we have an idea of maybe playing h5, h6, and creating weaknesses
Mm-hmm.
on his king. So h4, rook b7, and now we decide to go c4 just to support this knight. King
Mm-hmm.
f7, trying to get out of these pins so that this bishop can move finally.
Mm-hmm.
So now we start targeting things. So we play queen f3. So now we're targeting this, and we're also long range targeting this.
Mm-hmm.
So this bishop can't move again because of rook e7. And if this queen strays too far away from this rook, we have discovered attacks on that rook with the knight. So so white black's like, okay, well now that their queen's no longer here, I'll go back. And now what should white do here?
Keep going with h5 to create the weaknesses.
Okay, well there's actually something else we can do here that's slightly stronger.
Mm,
But it does create weaknesses just in a more subtle way.
mm-hmm. Um, the rook's good. The knight's good.
Yep.
Might as well move the queen.
Yep. So what's the right square?
Um, g3 is repetitive. h5 might. Well, what about e3?
E3 is good, but there's something slightly more accurate.
Mm. Um, c3 looks at the g7 pawn, or d3. Hmm.
So is there a move we can make that can threaten something?
Right. Well, the only thing that's what's hanging? Nothing's hanging.
Something is hanging. Just
Something is hanging.
tactically. Just tactically. Not
Okay.
immediately, but so the right move is
Well,
actually queen to e2. So the threat is queen to e8, which wins the bishop because the king is checkmated. So queen takes is forced, then rook takes, and there's a fork. So we're threatening to win the bishop, and remember the
right.
bishop can't really move. So basically, black has to create a flight square for his king, so that after queen e8, he can run with his king. So the reason why queen h5 wasn't quite as good is because g6 gains a
Mm,
tempo.
right.
Whereas now, after queen e2, g6, now we are ready to play h5 immediately.
What about oh, okay.
Right, and now
That's
queen
why
e8,
it's
now
better than
black can
e3.
play, well, if queen e8 right away, then black can, whoops. If queen e8, then black can play king g7, and okay, we're not really threatening anything anymore. But
Mm-hmm.
But now we can play h5, and now we're starting to break down black's king's defense. So after h5, uh, black obviously doesn't want to take because that just ruins his king-side structure. So he just tries to get his king out of the way and plays king to f8. So he wants to try to avoid this check, so he wants to be able to move his bishop or something. Okay, so what does white do here? So there are several ways to win here, but
right.
what's one of the clearest?
Take